The first snow of December had come early to Halifax, dusting the cobblestones outside Harbour and Salt Restaurant in a thin, apologetic layer that would be gone by morning. Inside, the dining room hummed with the particular energy of a Friday night, the kind where everyone wanted to be seen and no one wanted to be looked at too closely. Josephine Hale tied her apron strings tighter and told herself the cold she felt had nothing to do with the weather. She'd been at Harbour and Salt for 11 months. Long enough to know that the candlelight was strategically dim to hide the fact that the tablecloths hadn't been replaced since summer. Long enough to know that table 12 near the back corner was always reserved and never listed. That the manager, Gil, had a habit of disappearing for 20 minutes whenever certain guests arrived, and that the kitchen staff never asked questions about orders that came in without tickets. Josephine had learned not to ask questions either. She had reasons. Her mother, Paulette, was 61 and stubborn in the way that women who'd worked factory floors for 30 years tended to be stubborn. She'd been diagnosed with a heart condition 14 months ago, right around the same time Josephine's lease had ended, and the restaurant where she'd worked for 3 years had shut down with 2 weeks' notice and no severance. The timing had been almost artistic in its cruelty. Paulette needed medication that wasn't fully covered. The specialist appointments cost more than Josephine made in a week. Harbour and Salt paid well, better than it should have for a place this size, and Josephine had learned not to wonder why. She was refilling water glasses at table 9 when Gil appeared at her elbow, his breath smelling faintly of the whiskey he kept in the office drawer. "Big party just arrived," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Table 12, you're on it." Josephine looked up. She knew table 12. Everyone on staff did. "I thought Renee handled 12. Renee called in sick. Gil's eyes didn't quite meet hers. "You've been here long enough. Just be professional, don't chat, bring what they order, and come get me if anything feels off." She wanted to ask what off meant, exactly, but Gil was already walking away. Table 12 sat 4 men. They came in the way that certain men always came in, ahead of the noise, the room adjusting around them without anyone deciding to let it. The man who sat at the far end, facing the door, wore a dark wool overcoat that he didn't bother removing. His hair was silver at the temples, his jaw square and deliberate, and his eyes moved across the room with the kind of patience that wasn't really patience at all, just control wearing a slower mask. She'd learn later that his name was Vincent Caruso. But in that first moment, she just knew what her body knew before her mind caught up. This was a man who decided things, final things. The other 3 arranged themselves around him in a way that was too casual to be casual. One faced the entrance, one sat with his back to the wall. The third positioned himself near the aisle, angled toward the exit. Josephine had seen this before, not in restaurants. In the parking lot of the community center in Dartmouth, where her younger brother, Tommy, had briefly, disastrously, worked for people whose names she still couldn't say out loud without her hands going cold. She collected herself, grabbed 4 menus. "Good evening," she said, her voice the one she'd practiced over years of serving difficult tables. Warm, without being familiar. "Can I get anyone started with something to drink?" The 3 men ordered efficiently. Sparkling water, a scotch, another scotch. Vincent Caruso looked up at her for the first time. His eyes were a pale, almost colorless gray, the kind that registered everything and revealed nothing. "Still water," he said. "And whatever the kitchen does well tonight, not the menu version, what the chef actually makes." It was an unusual request, and Josephine noted that he'd asked it quietly. The way people asked things when they already knew the answer would be yes. "I'll find out," she said. She was halfway to the kitchen when she heard it. She hadn't meant to stop. There was a narrow service alcove beside the wine storage, and as she passed it, she caught the tail end of a phone call. A man she didn't recognize was pressed into the shadow there, his voice barely above a breath. Both exits covered. The side door in the kitchen. "Yeah, 20 minutes. He doesn't leave." The man ended the call and moved quickly toward the rear of the building. Josephine stood still for 3 seconds. The kitchen noise continued around her. Someone called an order number. Plates clattered. The world kept moving in its ordinary way while something inside her went very quiet and very alert. She thought about Tommy. Tommy, who'd been 22 and thought he was smarter than the situation. Tommy, who'd told her not to worry, that it was just moving things from one place to another, that nobody was going to get hurt. Tommy, who'd ended up in Halifax Infirmary for 6 days after the people he worked for decided he knew too much and too little at exactly the same time. He'd survived. Barely. And Josephine had spent the months afterward trying to understand what she could have done differently, what she would have done if she'd known, if she'd seen the signs in time. She saw the signs now. Her hands were steady as she relayed the drink order and asked the chef what he'd recommend off menu. But her mind was doing the calculation that she hadn't known she was capable of until Tommy had taught her, in the worst possible way, to do it. Someone was waiting outside this building. Someone else had just confirmed a location and a timeline. Vincent Caruso was sitting at table 12 with 3 men who thought they were protecting him, and none of them knew. She had nothing to do with this. She didn't know Vincent Caruso. She didn't know what he was, what he'd done, why someone wanted him not to leave this building. She thought about the side exit in the kitchen. She thought about Tommy in a hospital bed, IVs in his arm, telling her that the worst part wasn't the pain. The worst part was that someone had known and said nothing. Josephine picked up the drinks tray and walked back to table 12. She set down the waters with her usual efficiency. She placed the Scotch glasses. She made brief, professional eye contact with each man, and when she set Vincent Caruso's still water in front of him, she also set down the small folded receipt paper she'd palmed from the service station. She didn't look at him when she did it. She walked directly to the service station near the kitchen entrance and began unnecessarily reorganizing the cutlery, keeping her back straight and her expression neutral, listening to the sounds of the room. It was perhaps 40 seconds before she felt the quality of the air at table 12 change. She didn't look. She didn't need to. She could hear it in the slight shift of weight, the pause in conversation. Then Vincent Caruso said, "I'd like to see the dessert menu." One of his men started to say something. "The dessert menu," Caruso repeated. Same tone, no emphasis, final. The man to his right stood slowly and moved toward the entrance, seemingly to stretch, to look out the window at the snow. But Josephine had watched enough people move with purpose disguised as casualness to understand what he was actually doing. She kept restacking the cutlery. The next 15 minutes passed with excruciating normality. Josephine served 2 other tables. She brought bread to table 7. She smiled at the couple celebrating what looked like an anniversary at table 3, refilled their wine. She made herself be present in each moment, while some part of her stood apart and watched the room like a woman, waiting for a storm she could already smell. Then she noticed the man by the front window make a subtle gesture. She glanced toward the street through the frosted glass. 2 figures had been standing under the awning of the building, across from harbor and salt. Now they were moving. She was already walking toward table 12 when Caruso stood. He moved with the unhurried authority of someone who'd made his decision 30 seconds ago, and was only now letting his body catch up. His men rose around him. One dropped cash on the table, far more than the bill. She could see that from here. Caruso stopped at the end of the table. For a moment he looked directly at Josephine across the length of the dining room, and she felt the full weight of that pale grey gaze. He didn't nod, didn't acknowledge her. But something in the stillness of his expression told her the message had been received, understood, and its origin recorded precisely. Then they were gone. She moved to the window. Through the frosted glass, she watched Caruso and his men walk to the black car at the curb with that same unhurried quality. And she watched, too, as a second vehicle she hadn't noticed before pulled up from the opposite direction. The 2 figures who'd been crossing the street from the awning stopped. One of them reached into his jacket and then didn't. They looked at each other. The second vehicle's doors opened. Whatever happened in the next 30 seconds, Josephine couldn't see clearly through the snow and the distance, but she saw the 2 figures retreat, walk quickly away, disappear around the corner. Caruso's car pulled smoothly into traffic. Josephine stepped back from the window. "You all right?" The dishwasher, a 17-year-old named Papin who never asked about anything, had materialized beside her with a stack of plates. "Fine," she said. "Just cold." She collected the cash from table 12 and counted it mechanically. The dinner for 4 had come to $211. There was $640 on the table. She found the card under the bottom bill. No logo, no name. Just a phone number, handwritten in clean square characters. She held it for a long moment. Then she tucked it into the front pocket of her apron and went to clear table 9. She didn't sleep that night. Her apartment in Dartmouth was small. The kind of small that only works if you know where everything is and don't try to have people over. She lay on her back, listening to the pipes settle and the occasional car on the street below, and told herself that she had done one small thing and it was finished. She had no further obligation. She had protected herself by doing nothing that could be traced, nothing that could be proved. She had written 7 words on a receipt paper. Side door, kitchen exit, 20 minutes, 3 men, and that was all. She knew it wasn't. She knew because she'd seen men like those 2 in the street before. She'd seen the way they moved, the way they'd reached for something inside their coats. She knew what that meant, and she knew that she'd been standing 15 feet from Vincent Caruso when she'd made her choice, which meant that at least some of his people had seen her make it. She got up at 5:30. made coffee, stood at her kitchen window and watched the street while the sky went from black to that particular grey-purple of maritime winter mornings. She thought about calling in sick. She thought about calling Tommy and then immediately decided against it. He was doing well now, working a legitimate job at a print shop in Moncton, and she wasn't going to pull him back into this orbit with her. She thought about what it would take to disappear again. She'd done it once before, after what happened to Tommy. She'd moved from Dartmouth to Truro, then back. She'd changed her number. She'd stopped contacting people from her old life until she was certain no one from that situation was looking for her anymore. She was tired of disappearing. Josephine went to work. The morning prep shift was quiet. She was setting tables when Gil found her, his expression carrying the specific strain of a man trying to seem calmer than he was. "Last night," he started. "Table 12 ordered off menu and tipped well," Josephine said. "Is there an issue with the till?" Jill studied her. "No issue." He paused. "Renee's coming back Monday." "Great," Josephine said and went back to the napkin folds. She was folding the third napkin when the front door opened. It was 11:40 in the morning. Harbour and Salt didn't open until noon. She heard Gil's voice, then a silence that had shape to it, and then Gil said, "Josephine, there's someone asking for you." Vincent Caruso was standing in the entrance of the restaurant in the same wool overcoat. Without the Friday night crowd and the candlelight and the architecture of the evening around him, he looked, she thought, like what he probably was, a man who was used to the cold and had stopped letting it bother him. "Miss Hale," he said. He knew her name. Of course he did, Mr. Caruso. She was surprised by how steady her own voice was. "I'd like to speak with you if you have a few minutes." Josephine looked at him. "Can I take my break now?" "Sure," Gil said. He didn't move. Privately, she added. They sat at table 3, the anniversary table. In daylight, it was unremarkable. Just a table by a window with a view of the harbour, the water flat and pewter grey under the low. "I'm going to say what I came to say, and then you can decide what to do with it," Caruso said. He didn't look like a man who usually explained himself. "You saw something last night. You made a choice that cost you nothing obvious, and could have cost you a great deal. I want to understand why." "I don't know what you mean," Josephine said. "Yes, you do." She held his gaze. He didn't look away. "My brother," she said finally. "He was involved with people like—" She paused. "He got hurt because nobody said anything. Because there were people who knew something was going to happen, and they told themselves it wasn't their problem." She looked at the harbour. "I couldn't do that. I tried to do the calculation, and I couldn't land on the version where I said nothing." Caruso was quiet for a moment. "What happened to your brother? He survived. He's fine now." She heard the defensiveness in her own voice and softened it. "But it was close. What was he involved in? I'm not going to answer that." Another pause. Caruso seemed to regard the non-answer as acceptable. "The people who were outside last night. They work for a man named Aldrich Fenn. You won't have heard of him. He operates primarily in finance, legitimate on the surface. What he does underneath is less legitimate. I've been building a case against his network for 2 years. Last night was meant to end that before the case could reach anyone who would act on it." Josephine absorbed this. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Fenn's people saw you at the table. They didn't see what you did. The receipt, that was well handled, but they saw that you were there, and they'll want to understand why I'm still alive. That puts you in a position you didn't ask for." She'd already understood this, somewhere around 3 in the morning. "So what do I do?" "That depends on what you want." Caruso placed both hands flat on the table, a gesture that seemed deliberate, like he was making himself legible. "You can tell me this has nothing to do with you and walk away. I'll make certain my people don't involve you further, and I'll do my best to ensure Fenn's network doesn't conclude you were anything other than a coincidence. There's some risk in that, but it's manageable. Or you help me. Not in any way that puts you in danger. But you're a witness to what you heard last night. A credible witness with no connection to my operation, no stake in the outcome. That kind of testimony has weight that mine doesn't." Josephine looked at him carefully. "What did you expect? Someone who wouldn't bother explaining, who'd just tell me what was going to happen?" Something shifted in his face. "It wasn't quite before," he said. "I won't make it again." She wanted to ask what he meant. She filed it. "I need to think," she said. "Of course." He reached into his coat and placed a card on the table, actual business card this time, with a name and a number. "That number reaches me. Not an assistant, not a team. Me. If you decide to talk further, call it. If you decide not to, throw it away and I'll make sure you're not bothered." He stood. "I'm sorry for the position you're in, Miss Hale. You didn't deserve to be in it." "No," she said. "I didn't." He nodded once, with what felt like genuine respect, and walked out. Josephine sat at table 3 for a long time after the door closed. The thing she hadn't told him, the thing she hadn't told anyone, was that she hadn't just heard the man in the service alcove. She'd also recognized him. Not his face, his jacket. A specific field jacket with a torn left cuff, the kind of tear that happened when a zipper catch broke and wasn't fixed. She'd seen that jacket before, on a man who'd been in the parking lot of Tommy's print shop in Moncton 3 weeks ago, when she'd gone to visit for the weekend. She'd noticed it the way she noticed things now, catalogued it without knowing why. She knew why now. Fenn's network had already been watching Tommy, whether to use him as leverage or to tidy up loose ends from the Dartmouth situation years ago, she didn't know, but the connection existed, and it was already there before last night, which meant the danger wasn't something she'd created. It was something that had been circling toward her and Tommy for a while, and last night had only changed the timing. She called the number on Caruso's card from the restaurant's back office. He answered on the second ring. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said. There was a pause. "I'm listening." She told him about the jacket, about Tommy's print shop, about Moncton. When she finished, Caruso said, "Is your brother safe right now? I don't know. Give me 30 minutes. He called back in 22. "Your brother is fine. I have people watching the print shop now, discreetly. He isn't aware and doesn't need to be yet." A pause. "This changes things, Miss Hale. If they've already connected you to your brother, then the risk of walking away is higher than I told you this morning." "I know," she said. "What do you want to do?" Josephine looked at the harbor through the office window. The snow from the night before had melted except in the shadows of the buildings, and the water was moving again, slow gray swells that caught the light and lost it. "I want it to end," she said. "Not just for me, for Tommy. Properly ended, not just pushed sideways. I want there to be a version of next year where I don't check over my shoulder every time he calls. That's what I want too," Caruso said. "For different reasons, but the same destination. Then let's figure out how to get there." What followed was not the version she'd imagined. In the half-formed way she'd imagined anything during those years of careful invisibility. She'd thought, in a vague way, that confronting something like this would be dramatic, loud. She was wrong. It was paperwork, mostly. It was sitting across a conference table from a woman named Detective Sergeant Francine Osei of the RCMP's Integrated Financial Crime Unit, telling her methodically what she had seen and heard, and then telling it again and then again with slightly different questions. It was learning that Aldrich Fenn's network had been under investigation for 7 months, and that what Josephine had witnessed at Harbour and Salt was the attempted elimination of their single most important cooperating source, Vincent Caruso, before a scheduled meeting with federal prosecutors. It was realizing, slowly, that Caruso wasn't just a man who operated in gray spaces. He was a man who had decided, 2 years ago, to stop, who had gone to federal investigators and offered everything he knew in exchange for a path out, and who had been methodically, painstakingly building that case ever since, at considerable personal risk, because he'd understood that there was no other version of the rest of his life that he could live with. She asked him about it directly one evening when they were going over timelines in the safe location the RCMP had arranged, a rented house in the South End that smelled of other peopleture. "Why?" she said. "If you could have just," she gestured vaguely. "Kept going?" Caruso said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He had a habit of not filling silences, which she'd come to find less intimidating and more honest as the weeks passed. "I had a daughter," he said finally. "She was 8 when she understood, in the way children understand things before they have language for it, what her father did, what the life was." He paused. "But she started looking at me differently, and I thought, if I continue, I will keep her safe in all the material ways, and I will lose her anyway, slowly, through the things she'd have to do to keep loving me." He looked at his hands. "I couldn't do that to her." Josephine thought about Tommy, about the years of distance, the careful conversations, the things she hadn't said because they were too heavy. "Where is she now?" "University of Toronto. 2nd year." He almost smiled. "She wants to be an architect. That's good," Josephine said. "Yes," he said. "It is." They didn't talk much about what came after. There was too much immediate ground to cover, too many details to corroborate it and verify. But sometimes, in the gaps between sessions, she found herself thinking about it. The after. What it looked like when the thing she'd been quietly terrified of for 3 years was finally, actually finished. The arrests came on a Thursday morning in late February. Josephine was at the restaurant when Detective Sergeant Osei called. She stepped into the back alley, the cold hitting her immediately, and listened to the list of names, the coordinated warrants executed across Halifax, Toronto, and Vancouver. Aldrich Fenn had been taken into custody at his office in downtown Halifax at 8:15 that morning. Josephine leaned against the brick wall of the alley and stared at the sky, which was the pale, clear blue that came after storms, and felt something she hadn't felt so cleanly in years. It wasn't exactly happiness, it was more structural than that, like something that had been slightly off-kilter inside her chest had finally been set back into its correct position. She called Tommy. He answered on the first ring the way he always did when she called, because he'd understood since the infirmary days that her calls meant something. "Joe," he said. "Hey," she said. "I have something to tell you, and it's going to require some explaining, and I need you to let me get through the whole thing before you start asking questions." A pause. She could hear him sitting down somewhere, the creak of the print shop stool. All of it, start to finish. He didn't interrupt once. When she finished, there was a long silence. "You should have told me," he said finally, his voice careful and not quite steady. "I know. I'm sorry, Joe." Another pause. "You were protecting me. I was doing what made sense at the time. You always do," Tommy said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard in a long time, something that had been absent since the hospital, since the careful years. Relief, plain and real. "You're going to be okay now?" "I think so," she said. "I think so." She went back inside after the call and worked the lunch service and the dinner service and the close, and she was refilling salt shakers at 11:30 when she found the envelope under the corner table. Table 12. She hadn't seen it placed there. She didn't know when it had appeared. Inside was a single card, the same style as the ones before, 2 lines in that same clean square handwriting. "Halifax Harbour Ferry, Saturday, 10 a.m. Coffee is on me this time." Josephine read it twice. She thought about the weight of the last 3 months. She thought about Saturday morning down. She thought about Saturday morning, and the ferry and the harbour in the particular winter light she'd been looking a whole life without ever quite being able to leave it behind. She tucked the card into her apron pocket. She finished the salt shakers. She clocked out. She walked home through the cold Halifax night, her breath making small clouds in the dark, and for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, she walked without looking over her shoulder. The street behind her was just a street, empty and ordinary, and hers.